Please be seated. This Lent, we've noted a recurring theme of trust in our gospel and the Hebrew scriptures, and this week is no different. Moses grapples with his community that complains, "Oh, why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" And Jesus encounters a Samaritan woman at a well who had every reason to be wary of entering into a conversation with this strange man, much less trust that he indeed would be the one who could quench her thirst for simple kindness and belonging. What are you thirsty for? It's the third Sunday in Lent, in our Lenten wilderness. Has it become any clearer? Do you trust that it's any closer? You know, a primary icon for suffering throughout the history of human existence has been thirst. Water is the most essential element in life, and when we lack it, boy, do we have trouble. And sometimes when we have too much of it, boy, do we have trouble. Countless conflicts around the world have centered on water, even right here in the American Southwest. Colorado River rights, anyone? I feel like I've been treated to a cool, crisp taste of living water this week, just as our gardens have been treated to life-giving rain these past months. You know that feeling that happens in your mouth when you're really thirsty, you know, like that morning mouth, dry mouth? And then you take a sip of cool water and everything just sort of feels alive again. Well, for me, the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well is like that refreshing water that sort of just makes our Lenten gospel start to bloom with promise and insight. 2 Sundays ago, we heard how Jesus, fresh from his baptism in the River Jordan, a place with a lot of water, went into the desert to fast and pray. Certainly a place where you don't find much water. And in that quiet, he listened for his call. He discerned his thirst for who God was calling him to be, and put behind him those voices that sought to distract or even destroy him. And he used the suffering and thirst to his advantage, just as we engage in our Lenten disciplines because we thirst for more in our lives. And then last Sunday, Nicodemus, the Pharisee, thirsted for more as well. He was intrigued by Jesus and his teaching, but as a man of privilege and status, he was so full of his own learning and preconceptions that he couldn't trust the truth of who Jesus was, nor taste what Jesus' living water could do for his life. Well, this week's encounter at the well is actually a brilliant and deliberate contrast to last week's dialogue with Nicodemus. See, these stories sit side by side in the gospel on purpose, and that demands our attention. Jesus was on his way back north to Galilee, and he arrived in the town of Sychar. He had left Jerusalem, the center of Jewish worship and power where he had encountered Nicodemus, and he deliberately chose to take the route that led him through the heart of Samaria instead of along the Jordan River Valley, the usual route. Sychar, or Shechem, as it was known in Old Testament times, lay at the foot of Mount Gerizim, where the Samaritans asserted that God was to be worshipped. It was an age-old feud, between the Judeans and the Samaritans, these rival locations of worship. And this dramatic change of location would have been an obvious juxtaposition for the Gospel's Jewish 1st and 2nd century audiences. For For us, it would be like the establishing shot of the Kremlin after a scene at the White House in a contemporary espionage thriller. In other words, Jesus was deep in enemy territory. Exhausted, he came to rest by a well. And there in the midday heat came a woman alone. And now this encounter was not just highly unusual, it was scandalous. Scandalous, I say. Women in first century Palestine, they were not supposed to be out by themselves. And the normal time for women to fetch water was early morning and early evening. It was the job of the lower status women who went in groups. But this woman chose, or was more likely forced, to retrieve water in the harsh noonday sun. She was probably outcast, even among the lower class women, and the reason why was clarified in her exchange with Jesus. She'd had 5 previous husbands, and now she was with a man who was not her husband. Now, whether she had been widowed or divorced or discarded or passed from husband to husband, we don't know. But in any case, she was at the point where her disappointments and poverty were so deep that she'd given up on the possibility of any legitimate relationships, and even the company of the other lower status women. If Nicodemus exemplified the privilege of the elites, she was an icon of the destitute. But that was just the surface of the scandal. Because Jesus had earned the title of rabbi, and according to Jewish law, he shouldn't even look at a woman in public. And what's more, Jesus engaged her in conversation and asked her to share water with him. And she was not just a woman, she was a Samaritan woman. And in the eyes of the Jews, that made her ritually impure. So Jesus was with a low-class, morally suspect, unclean, enemy woman. And rather than shunning or judging her, he treated her as he should only have treated a female family member. She went from outsider to insider, and Jesus voluntarily jeopardized his status and his purity to make that happen. Now compare her situation with Nicodemus. Right? He was fearful of judgment and loss of reputation. So he seeks Jesus out in the middle of the night, terrified that people might see him. Jesus, however, approached the Samaritan woman at noonday in a public place. I just love the irony of these two iconic narratives being placed side by side. Because in the bright light of noonday, this simple, lonely, outcast woman engages in the longest recorded dialogue in any gospel with Jesus. At first, she didn't get it. Like Nicodemus, she, being confused about being born again, she took Jesus literally as well. I mean, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get this living water?" But the Samaritan woman kept at it. She knew her thirst acutely. She had no illusions about herself. She knew she was at the bottom, and that suffering broke her open to something more. So when the strange, learned rabbi spoke to her about living water, she begged for a sip. She was anxious and open for anything to fill her cup, and she trusted him. A bold move. Now, once upon a time, there was a man on a frantic quest for the meaning of life. He finally made it to a wise sage in the Himalayas, and he begged him for the secret of enlightenment. And the sage offered him tea and quietly filled the seeker's teacup to overflowing as the man rattled on about his spiritual efforts. And not until the seeker was scalded did he interrupt his own prattling to comment on the spillage. And what can you imagine was the wise man's response? Your soul is like a teacup, so full it cannot hold what you seek. You must empty yourself if you want to make room for enlightenment. Emptying yourself, making yourself vulnerable. The seeker in this fable, like Nicodemus, was so full of expectations and knowledge, experience, that he had no ability to recognize his thirst, much less see the living water in front of him that he could quench it. It was only by his suffering, by being scalded by the boiling tea, that he could wake up. Whether Nicodemus ever woke up is a mystery for the ages. But we do know that the Samaritan woman encountered Jesus not just with an empty cup, but she was a completely empty vessel. She was parched. She knew suffering that few of us can imagine. She didn't seek Jesus out of intellectual curiosity like Nicodemus. She would never have had the privilege of that. She was broken. And she knew her thirst for more, and Jesus saw her brokenness and offered to fill her soul, to mend her heart, and assuage her thirst with his love, that she might be reborn. And as a result, she forgot her outcast status. She ran back to the city, leaving the water behind, and told the others of her encounter with him. An encounter that actually reinforced her outcast status. And after all, what was she doing alone with another man, right? Who was not her husband. And a Jew, no less. And what's more, she didn't go back to town with explanations or theological certainties. She didn't say, oh, I found out the truth, let me convince you. No, she simply shared her experience and invited others to meet this Christ and ask questions. So what does this woman's experience with Jesus offer us? How does this gospel help us to find the right place and time to encounter the divine? To hear and trust our calls and fill our cups from the springs of living water? Well, the first truth they expose is that we don't need to go somewhere else to encounter God. We don't need to go to Mount Gerizim or Jerusalem. Jesus says as much. We do not need to seek out teachers in the middle of the night. We need to trust that God is always present and can be encountered in the most unlikely places, at the most unusual times, with the least expected people. Maybe it's harder to encounter the divine when you're comfortable and familiar with familiar surroundings, with people who look and think and sound just like you. Because my experience has often been that the unfamiliar and surprising is what brings me closer to God. Perhaps a stranger or a foreigner in your midst, right? Maybe that's why God repeatedly challenged his chosen people to embrace the foreigners among them as members of their community. Maybe that's why he drove Abram from his comfortable home out into this new land. It's a thrust of our scriptures that's often conveniently forgotten. The person who quenches our spiritual thirst will often be the one we least expect. Perhaps a child or an addict. or a bartender or a waitress, a homeless person, maybe even an atheist. If we can trust enough to empty ourselves of our prejudices and the noisy lives that fill our brains, we might just glimpse the Christ in all types of people, and then hear all sorts of truths. The second truth that our scriptures offers us is that we must be in touch with our thirst, with our brokenness. We have to know that our cup is empty, and we have to know that cup intimately. We cannot fear and reject our suffering, our vulnerability. We must trust that they are crucial elements of our spiritual journey. And that's what Lent is for, right? We make ourselves vulnerable and we ask, where is the desert in my life? For what do I thirst? When have I been cast out? When have I cast out others? Why is my love dried up? How deep and raw are my wounds? And then we have to ask ourselves, where is it leading me? How can they make me stronger and more gracious and more alive? When we make ourselves like that Samaritan woman, perhaps we can be open to encountering a stranger who knows everything that we've ever done and has compassion for it. Trust him to tug out the questions deep inside us, to calm our fears that keep us running away, and touch and heal the wounds we hide from view. And then allow them to fill our cups with the promise of living water. May it be so. Amen.